Once, in a prestigious university lecture hall, an ordinary day was about to take an unexpected turn. The room was filled with eager students, all anticipating another one of Professor Hartman's famous philosophical debates. Professor Hartman, known for his sharp wit and controversial views, had built a reputation for challenging deeply held beliefs. But no one could have predicted what would happen on this particular day. The topic for the day was theology and its influence on the modern world, a subject that often sparked heated discussions. As usual, Professor Hartman opened the lecture with a brief overview of the history of religion. He spoke about how different belief systems shaped the course of human history, but his tone was unmistakably dismissive. He poked fun at various religious figures, but his target for the day seemed to be none other than Jesus Christ. With a smirk on his face, Professor Hartman began to deconstruct the story of Jesus, speaking in a mocking tone. A carpenter who somehow became the Son of God, born in a manger, performs miracles, dies on a cross, and then rises from the dead. Quite the tale, wouldn't you say? The students chuckled nervously, unsure of how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged glances, wondering how far he would take it. But there was one student in the room who wasn't laughing. Barron, a young man in the back of the room, had always been reserved, known for his quiet nature. He was a devout Christian, but he rarely spoke up in class. Today, however, something about the professor's tone struck a nerve. Barron felt a surge of frustration bubbling up inside him, and for the first time, he decided to stand up for his faith. His hands trembled slightly as he raised them, seeking permission to speak. Professor Hartman, noticing Barron's attempt to interject, waved him off. "Ah, young Barron, I know what you're going to say. You're going to defend this fairy tale, right?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Go ahead, I'm listening." The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Barron stood up slowly, his heart racing, but there was a calmness in his demeanor that surprised everyone. He looked directly at the professor and spoke, his voice steady but firm. "Professor, I understand that you may not believe in Jesus Christ, and that's your prerogative. But mocking him, especially in a setting like this, isn't just disrespectful, it's harmful." The students who had been holding their breath were now exchanging puzzled looks. They hadn't expected this from Barron, but it wasn't just his words that caught them off guard. It was the conviction with which he spoke. It was as if Barron wasn't just defending a historical figure, but a deeply personal truth that had shaped his life. His words resonated, not just with the other Christians in the room, but even with those who were indifferent to the topic. Professor Hartman raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "You think your religious beliefs should be exempt from scrutiny, Barron? That we should all just believe in fairy tales without questioning them?" His voice was still mocking, but there was a hint of uncertainty now. Barron shook his head. "No, Professor, I don't expect anyone to believe without questioning. Faith is something that's deeply personal, and questioning is a part of that process. But what you did wasn't questioning. It was belittling. You're using your position of authority to mock something that millions hold sacred, and that's not academic debate, it's disrespect." The tension in the room was palpable. No one had ever spoken to the professor like this before. The students, who were used to hearing Hartman's sarcastic jabs without challenge, were now unsure of how to react. Some of them were visibly uncomfortable. Others were impressed by Barron's courage. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Barron continued, his voice softening but still resolute. "I'm not asking you to believe what I believe, Professor. I'm just asking for respect. If we can't have that in a place of learning, then what are we really here for?" The professor stood still for a moment, his face unreadable. He glanced around the room, perhaps expecting to see students siding with him. But instead, many of them seemed to be contemplating Barron's words. Some even nodded subtly in agreement. It was clear that Barron had struck a chord. Professor Hartman finally broke the silence. His tone was no longer mocking, but thoughtful. I hadn't considered it from that perspective, he admitted. I suppose I've become so used to challenging things for the sake of challenge, I didn't stop to think about the impact it could have. The students were stunned. This was a side of the professor they had never seen before. Barron's simple yet powerful response had managed to break through the professor's hardened exterior, and for the first time that day, the room felt less like a battleground and more like a space for dialogue. Professor Hartman continued, I'm not going to suddenly convert, Barron, but I do understand now why you felt the need to speak up, and I apologize if I crossed a line. Barron nodded, his expression softening. Thank you, Professor. That means a lot. The rest of the class resumed in an atmosphere of unexpected respect. The professor, now more mindful of his words, shifted the conversation to a more thoughtful examination of religious narratives. Barron, though still reserved, felt a quiet sense of victory, not because he had won an argument, but because he had stood his ground with dignity and in doing so, had earned the respect of those around him. In the days that followed, the incident became the talk of the university. Students from all disciplines began discussing the importance of respectful debate and the fine line between questioning and mockery. But more than anything, they spoke about the quiet strength of one student who, in the face of mockery, chose to respond not with anger but with reason, compassion, and respect. Barron's response had left a lasting impact on everyone in that room. It wasn't just the professor who had learned something that day. The entire class had been reminded that respect for one another's beliefs is essential in any conversation, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak your truth, even in the face of mockery. The weeks following that lecture were transformative for many students. Conversations about faith, respect, and intellectual integrity rippled through the university. What had initially started as a heated exchange had blossomed into a broader discussion about the boundaries of academic freedom and the responsibilities of those in positions of power. Professor Hartman's class, which was once known for its caustic humor and sharp, often dismissive jabs at various belief systems, gradually shifted. The atmosphere became less about challenging for the sake of challenging, and more about genuinely exploring ideas with empathy. Barron, for his part, became something of a quiet hero on campus. He wasn't the type to boast or draw attention to himself, but his peers noticed. Some of them, who had never been religious or even considered the deeper meanings of faith, began to reflect more on the importance of dialogue in their own lives. Barron's willingness to speak up in defense of his beliefs, without resorting to anger or disrespect, served as an example to others. It wasn't about agreeing with someone else's perspective, but about engaging in meaningful, thoughtful conversation where everyone's views were valued. One afternoon, Barron was approached by a fellow student named Jessica, who had sat in the back of the class during the exchange. She was an agnostic, having grown up in a family where religion was never discussed. But after witnessing Barron's calm yet firm defense of his beliefs, she felt compelled to reach out. I don't know if you remember me, Jessica started hesitantly, but I just wanted to say, I really respected what you did in class the other day. I wasn't sure how to feel about the whole situation at the time, but after thinking about it, I realized that I'd never actually heard someone speak about their faith in such a respectful way. It made me rethink how we talk about things we don't agree on. Barron smiled, though he was still a bit surprised by the message. Thank you, Jessica. That means a lot. I guess I just think that if we're going to debate or discuss anything, we need to listen to each other and respect where we're coming from. Faith isn't something I try to force on anyone, but it's also not something I'll let someone mock without standing up for it. Jessica nodded, clearly appreciating Barron's words. I think I've spent a lot of time avoiding conversations like that. I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable, especially if I wasn't sure where I stood. But you showed me that it's possible to have a discussion, even about difficult topics, without it turning into a fight. As the semester went on, Barron found himself in more conversations, not just about religion, but about personal beliefs in general. Students from various backgrounds began to approach him, some seeking understanding about faith, others wanting to hear his perspective on tolerance and respect. Barron didn't have all the answers, but he listened, shared his thoughts, and encouraged others to do the same. Professor Hartman, too, had changed in subtle but significant ways. He had always prided himself on his ability to challenge students, pushing them to question everything. But after Barron's intervention, he found himself reflecting more on his own teaching style. He began to notice the impact of his words, not just in his students' academic work, but in their emotional well-being. The mocking tone he'd once used so freely had started to feel more like a tool of division than a bridge to understanding. He began incorporating more balanced discussions, inviting students to explore not only the flaws in religious ideas, but also the deep-rooted values they could offer. It was a small shift, but it was a powerful one. For the first time, students who had previously been hesitant to engage in these debates began to feel more comfortable. They felt that their voices mattered, that they could express themselves without fear of ridicule. A few months later, during the final lecture of the semester, Professor Hartman opened the floor for a student-led discussion. "Today," he said, "we'll take a step back from my usual lectures. Instead, I'd like to hear from you all. What do you think is the role of respect in challenging ideas?" Students tentatively raised their hands, but one student stood up first, Barron. The professor nodded, acknowledging his presence. "I think respect," Barron began, "is the foundation for any meaningful conversation. If we're not willing to listen to each other and acknowledge that everyone comes from a different place, we're not really debating. We're just talking past each other." Professor Hartman leaned back in his chair, his eyes softening. "That's very well put, Barron. You've taught me a lot about that this semester." The room fell silent for a moment, and then other students began speaking, sharing their own thoughts on how respect shaped their discussions over the course of the semester. Some spoke of how they had learned to listen more actively. Others discussed how they had become more aware of the power dynamics in academic settings. But all of them agreed on one thing. The exchange Barron had initiated in that fateful lecture had changed the way they saw each other, their professor, and even their own beliefs. The class ended with a newfound sense of unity, a sense that, despite their differences, they had come to understand each other better. Barron's simple yet profound intervention had sparked something in the room, an awareness that intellectual discussions weren't just about proving one's point, but about engaging in a deeper search for truth, with empathy, respect, and a willingness to listen. As Barron walked out of the lecture hall that day, he felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just that he had stood up for his faith, it was that he had helped create an environment where open dialogue was possible, where people felt safe to express themselves without fear of mockery. In the end, that was the true victory. And though the incident with Professor Hartman had started with mockery, it ended with something far more powerful: understanding. It was a lesson for everyone involved that sometimes, even in the most unexpected of situations, a single person's voice could change the course of a conversation, and perhaps even a mindset.